Hello everyone, in today's video, I'm going to be sitting down with Isaac Puglia, the CEO of the GMAT and talking through some of the most asked questions that I get about the GMAT on this channel. We're going to focus on demystifying some concerns that I know a lot of you have and dive into some tips for how to elevate your study process. Prior to founding the GMAT strategy, Isaac worked as an instructor at both Manhattan Prep and Test Crackers, so he has almost 20 years of experience working on the GMAT. In addition to his years of experience helping others, he also scored a 760 on the exam back in his day, so he is certainly well qualified to answer all of your questions. Isaac has been a tremendous help for me on my own GMAT studying journey, and I look forward to diving into this conversation with him today. Let's get started.
All right, Isaac, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to jumping into some of the most asked questions that I get across TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, all over the place. So jumping straight into it, the first section is about business school generally. So something that a lot of people ask me is, should I take the GMAT exam or the GRE if I want to go to business school? And that might seem like an easy answer, but with some of the changes that we've seen in the last year, it is a bit of a bigger question than it might have used to be. So would love to hear, what is your input, GMAT, GRE, if business school and MBA is the end goal?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on. I'm a huge fan of the channel. So this is a big honor for me, and it's a fun little thrill. It's a great question. I think people should be asking which exam is best for them, because the process can be a big challenge no matter what, and there's no use in trying to make it harder than it otherwise would be by picking an exam that's not a good fit for you personally. I think the main decision points for most people are going to be that the GRE is a lot more memorization intensive than the GMAT's going to be. And that's on two fronts. The biggest difference between the two exams is there's tons and tons of vocabulary on the GRE. And so unless your vocabulary is amazing and you did undergrad in English literature or something like that, you're probably going to be wanting to memorize 2,000 to 3,000 words over the course of your studies, which is going to be a significant challenge for most people. And it's very, very difficult to shortcut that process. There's certainly things you can do to be strategic about it, but there's just a raw amount of time that's going to be necessary to do that. And there's two things that compound that. First, on the GRE, 50% of your verbal score is from that vocabulary knowledge. So it's very, very difficult to get around that. And then also on the GRE, there's still quite a bit of geometry content. And so that's going to require a decent amount of memorization for most people. On the GMAT, there's no vocabulary and virtually no geometry. So what I always tell people is, if you're on a tight timeline or you need like the fastest results possible, then you definitely want to go for GMAT. If you have a longer timeline to study and you feel like memorization is a strength for you, then that's where the GRE can be a good fit for certain types of people. The last thing to consider there is data knowledge and like data interpretation. For most of the folks watching this, you're going to be business people, probably in finance. And so you're probably going to have data interpretation and working with data as a strength, because it's probably what you do on a regular basis. There's going to be quite a bit more data style questions on the GMAT and quite a bit fewer of those on the GRE. So on the GRE, you might see 2 data related questions per section, whereas on the GMAT, you're probably going to see somewhere between 12 and 15. So if you feel like that's a strength for you, reading charts and graphs, answering questions based on spreadsheets, then GMAT's probably a good fit. If that's a weakness for you for whatever reason, then GRE might be the better test for you. At the end of the day, 80% of people are going to perform about the same on both exams. And if you're really not sure, you should just take a practice test for both. They both have free practice tests available, and just see which one you like better and then run with that.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And just with everything in the world, in life, in your career, you got to go with where your strengths are. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And then because I have a pretty big international audience too, and I know we'll get into it a little bit later, but that vocabulary, if English is your second language or third language, that can be increasingly challenging. Whereas math is, for lack of better terms, a universal language. So I think that makes a lot of sense as well. Kind of transitioning to still on the business school front, I know with the new GMAT Focus exam, the scaling of scores has changed, but what is kind of a target score that someone should aim for in order to feel confident about their application getting accepted for an M7 school?
Yeah, I mean, M7 schools are competitive by definition. I think there's two ways to think about this. The first is if you are in a non-traditional applicant pool. So I would say somewhere around 50% of the people applying to M7 schools are going to be in consulting or finance.
Yeah.
And that's by far the majority of people. And I think a lot of people who are coming from other industries like education or maybe marketing feel like that's a disadvantage for them, but actually it's an automatic advantage because you automatically stand out from the rest of the applicant pool. So if you're in that demographic where you're coming from outside of banking and finance and consulting, then somewhere around the 655 range is a good place to shoot for. GMAT Focus scores are trending about 55 points lower than GMAT Classic scores. But one of the confusing things about applying this year is the business schools don't have data from GMAT Focus yet. And so all the median and average scores you see on the website are all GMAT Classic, which is the old score scale. So that's just a bit of confusion that we're all going to be navigating. Hopefully the schools are going to have some data over the next couple of years as they get more graduates in who've taken Focus. But in the meantime, aiming for that 655 level if you're outside the traditional profiles is almost certainly going to be enough. So 645 to 665, I would stop studying for the exam and focus on other aspects of the application at that point.
Yeah.
Unless you've seen really high scores on your practice exams and you really need the scholarship money that can come with a much, much higher score.
Sure.
So that's more of a personal decision about like ROI, I guess,
Yeah.
on the time spend. If you're in the larger groups that apply to business school, like consulting and finance, then I think you're going to want to hit the median for those schools, which used to be like a 730, which has now become 675. So somewhere in that 665 to 685 range is going to be more than enough for most folks who are going to be in a situation like you're in.
Yeah.
And if you can get above that, that certainly helps. But that's the point past which I think there's diminishing returns.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. And I think, again, that's something that I tell a lot of people is sometimes having that non-traditional background for your career or whatever it may be, even your undergraduate degree, that can be an advantage just because you're not up against, an apples to apples comparison. So yeah, super interesting. Getting into studying for the actual GMAT, I think the most natural place to start is where to start. What is the best place to kind of start your whole GMAT prep journey?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's a lot of noise, unfortunately, on the internet. One of the things I hear most from people every year is like, I went to try to Google this, and I like just stepped away from the computer because there was way too many pieces of advice going 100 different directions. So I think the best way is get a copy of the official guide for GMAT review if you don't have one already. I think you've talked about that book on the channel before, and it's not hard to find if you web search it. If for whatever reason you're super financially constrained and you can't get a current copy of the book, a lot of times local libraries will have older editions of the book, which also work. That's a point of confusion. With GMAT Focus, there's no new problem types on the exam. So you can still use a lot of old materials from GMAT Classic. It's just that the format of the exam that you'll read about in those older editions of the book won't be relevant anymore. But as long as you understand that, older versions of the OG can work. But gauged against what you're going to invest in your education here, probably like the $50 or whatever for the OG is going to be doable for most people. So I would get a copy of that, and I would just do 10 of each of the problem types. So there's one problem type in quant called problem solving. That's a standard 5-option multiple choice question. There's 2 problem types in verbal, one reading comprehension, one critical reasoning. And then there's basically 2 types in data insights. One I call integrated reasoning, which is the charts, tables, graphs, etc., and then one called data sufficiency. So I would just do 10 of each of those types just to get a feel for the format of the questions and like what your job is on each individual question type, because there's a lot of question types that are unique to the GMAT.
Yeah.
And then I would take the first free practice exam from MBA.com. That's far and away the best way to start your prep, because then the test isn't completely ice cold where you're seeing a lot of noise in the data, like, oh, I didn't know I had 45 minutes
Right.
for this section, or oh, I had never seen a data sufficiency question before. That's
Yeah.
gonna make the data harder to interpret. But you also don't want to do what a lot of type A folks, not saying anyone in this group is going to be in that group, but by and large, we tend to be a self-selecting group with going to MBA programs in the first place. The natural inclination is like, I need to know everything perfectly before I take that first baseline test. And you really don't want to do that, because if you take your first baseline and you get a perfect score in verbal and a really bad score in quant, well, you probably just saved yourself 3 months of studying verbal and potentially like thousands of dollars of working with professional help on something you didn't actually need help on.
Right.
And so getting that first baseline test right after you do that slate of 10 individual questions for each type is huge, and far and away the best place to start. After that, once you get that first practice test worth of data, it's really about your learning style and your budget. That's going to dictate the next best step. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely jump into kind of the free and paid resources, but I think that was that what you went through is what I should have done. I was kind of what you mentioned, the type A, wanting to get as much done as possible and feel as confident as I possibly could before taking the first practice exam. And that just put almost too much pressure on myself to perform. I had this score in mind that I wanted to get. And just because I was thinking, oh, this is where I need to be. And like you said, I wasted a lot of time because realistically, my scoring for the verbal was pretty exceptional. And I had spent a lot of time practicing that. And it probably wasn't, like you said, the diminishing returns of that compared to if I had spent that time on certain aspects of quant would have been very beneficial. So I always give the same advice is, do a little bit of the practice, just because, as you mentioned, data sufficiency, if you've never seen questions like that before, is just an interesting way it's a different approach to answering questions that we're not used to. So I think a little bit of prep is important, but yeah, take the exam as early as you can, just so you can understand where you need to focus your strengths or focus on your weaknesses and go from there. So I think that's some great advice. You mentioned earlier how if you're on a bit of a time crunch, the GMAT might be smarter than the GRE. But what is that time crunch? What is kind of a typical timeline that someone can expect going into studying for the GMAT? Let's say they want to apply a year from now, so they're not on a crazy time crunch, but they don't want to be spending excess time. What can someone kind of anticipate spending? And then also kind of what does that mean in terms of the daily or the weekly hours that they need to put in?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with the way you asked the question. I think most people ask in terms of weeks or months, but I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think you want to think about it in terms of hours, because if you're working 100 hours a week at your job and you've got 5 hours a week on the weekends only to study, you're going to make slower progress than somebody who quit their job to study full time and is putting 50 hours a week into just pure studying, right? So the whole like hours, weeks, months thing, I think it's too variable.
Yeah.
Sorry, the whole weeks and months thing, but the hours thing is a good way to think about it. So this is going to be a little bit budget dependent, and also learning style dependent. As most of us are aware, some people are just super academically talented, and they just somehow came out of the womb with the right genetics for standardized tests or taking tests in general. And the truth is, like, they're probably going to have to work less hard and fewer hours to get the scores. Whereas some of us got the complete opposite genes, and we have other strengths. So what I can give is some averages that I've seen. And I think if you're using completely free resources and you're not going to invest in any professional help or guidance at all, you're probably looking at about 6 hours of study for each 1 point gain you want to make on your overall score. So let's say you come in at a 555 and your goal is 655. You want to make a 100-point gain. You're probably going to need 6 hours for each of those 100 points. And so you think about 600 hours or so if you're doing free resources.
Okay.
That way you can make a good calculation about how many months or weeks you're going to need, because then you can just take your personal situation and plug into it. So let's say I'm going to go that route and I can study 10 hours a week. I'm going to need 60 weeks to make that happen. And then you can backtrack to what a realistic like test day would look like. If we run down the list, the next up in the cost sphere would be books. A good set of books will run you couple $100. You might be able to get a good set at a library. Like I said, it's going to be a little outdated, but that's not the end of the world. That'll probably save most people about 100 hours. You're probably looking at around 5 hours of study for each 1 point gain on the overall score. If you can afford a digital self-paced class, without a live instructor, that's usually going to be somewhere in the like 500 to 1,000 US range.
Yeah.
And that's probably about 4 hours of study for each 1 point gain. So you think about the trade-off of maybe invest 1,000 but get a couple hundred hours back versus free, is a good way to think about that trade-off. And then you have live classes. What I've seen is about 3 hours of study for each 1 point gain. These are really rough averages, but it's
Sure.
lots and lots of data points over like 20 years of doing this. And then if you can get a great one-on-one tutor, that's going to be the most expensive option, but could save you a lot of time. That's probably going to be about 2 hours of study for each 1 point gain. And that's because everything's like fully fitted and customized for you personally.
Right.
So I think that usually gives people a good way to think through the whole like investment versus payoff kind of picture, and helps you pick the right path for you.
Yeah. No, I think that's important, because, yeah, too many of the times people are looking at, oh, it'll be 3 months. But when I started studying, I was in a different role and I had, a lot more time, and things change. And that's so 3 months of time for someone is very different than 3 months of time for someone else in terms of the actual free time that they have. So I think that's just super helpful. And because then it puts less pressure on the timeline. And I think for me, that became an issue at the end of my studying process when I first took the exam. Is I had the date in mind. I just was trying to cram, and then I'd be waking up at 5 a.m. to study, and because I thought I needed to do X amount per day, and then it just got to be very stressful. Whereas if you can kind of change your perspective on how you study, then it can feel a lot more sustainable, and take a little bit of that pressure off. So I think that's super helpful advice. You mentioned there the free resources. What are some good free resources? Of course, this is on YouTube. I think that is the number one. But if there's channels that you're familiar with or websites, I know GMAT Club does quite a bit. Would love to hear what those free resources are. Regardless if you're paying for a course or not, you can still leverage the free resources. So would be curious to hear what your thoughts are on those.
Yeah, for sure. The top free resource, like most important free resource, is those 2 MBA.com practice exams that we were talking about
Yeah.
before, because those are real retired GMAT questions, and you can get real actual data. And that's going to be a lot more valuable than like a third-party provider that's a simulation. It's not that there aren't good simulations out there. It's still a simulation.
Right.
It's not the real thing. So I think that's the most important one. The most utilized and most useful one probably is, like you said, YouTube. There's so much information out there for free. The problem with YouTube for a lot of people just starting out, I think, is there's too many
Right.
options.
Yeah.
So that can be a little bit of a drawback. So I think the number 2 option that I find myself recommending the most to people is GMATclub.com. And if you know how to filter for certain question types, that's something that I've found is a free feature on GMAT Club that a lot of people don't know about, because GMAT Club itself can be kind of overwhelming. I mean, you go to the homepage and there's like 100 different things you can click on, and it's like, oh wait, where do I go? But on GMAT Club, you've got study plans, which is that stuff's really valuable. Just in case people haven't filtered for specific question types, if you click on forum and then click forum again a second time, when you hit the web page, you'll see a list of all the question types that we talked through earlier. And if you click on those, you're able to see lists of all of those question types on all the forums. So if you needed to do 100 data sufficiency questions to beef up your data sufficiency skills, GMAT Club allows you to do that.
Yeah.
The question quality is going to be a lot more variable than the official guide. That's why I recommend the official guide. But if you have to go free, you have to go free.
Sure.
So those are kind of the top 2. If you're starting from scratch, from zero, then I like the GMAT Ninja free course.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the better free courses out there. And then we just started a project on our YouTube channel where we're doing a foundational math, like math from the very, very, very beginning. If you need help with that, then our channel can help you out with that, because there isn't really anything else out there like that on YouTube that I've found that's specific for GMAT, that doesn't bring in a lot of other like non-GMAT stuff. Like Khan Academy is great if you know what you need to work on. Like, okay, I need to relearn long division. Okay, Khan Academy is great for that. But if you're just starting, like, how do I prepare for the GMAT? Khan Academy is going to be just way too general.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. Look forward to diving into the videos on your channel. But yeah, from my experience with GMAT Club, it's nice to get, of course, just the way the forum is set up, you see all the different ways that you can solve a problem. And I think that was what was super helpful for me. Is sometimes the issue with one of the other paid resources or even just the GMAT official guide is there's the one result, and sometimes that's not necessarily what works best for you and for your brain. So GMAT Club is super helpful just in being able to scroll through, see different ways that people solve it, because as you know, there's many ways that you can get to the same result. So that's been a very helpful tool for me. Going into paid resources, that of course there's plenty of options, but there are some that are more well known than others. But what have you seen? Maybe the students you've worked with, or just from your own experience, where have kind of the better bang for your buck, or at least just where the quality of the results really has played a major role?
Yeah, it's also a super important question because a lot of times it's a big investment. And if you get the wrong program, you can get 6 months into the process
Yeah,
before you realize it wasn't the right fit for you, which obviously nobody wants to be in that situation, but it happens all the time. So the best paid resource always is going to be a one-on-one tutor who's recommended by someone you know, like, and trust. I mean, if you can get a personal recommendation from a friend or a colleague or somebody who's gone through the process, who's had success, and they worked with a one-on-one coach, that always is the fastest way to your goals, because speed and efficiency comes from customization. It's not that there's anything bad about like a one size fits all approach kind of program. It makes those programs a lot more affordable, which is great. And the whole AI thing is definitely making strides on like the everybody's going to have their own individual
yeah,
AI tutor in the future, which, is definitely a really cool thing. We're going to see a lot of developments in that over the next
yeah,
1 to 5 years, in my opinion, probably actually like between this year and like forever, actually.
yeah.
Um, but that technology has not, as of today, hasn't matured for the GMAT.
Right.
Like if you go on ChatGPT and you ask about GMAT plans, it's going to tell you about the old version of the exam. They're constantly updating that. That could improve. The meta AI is even worse. It'll tell you the wrong things to do sometimes.
Yeah.
So um, behind the scenes at our company, we've got a bunch of AI research projects going on, but it's not quite there yet. So that's why GMAT Club is probably the better bet for people in the short run. And that goes for if you're using the official guide as well in your own prep. Even if you're using the official guide, it's great to web search those questions and check out the
Yeah.
alternate explanations on GMAT Club that you were talking about. But that's always the best paid resource, is someone who's going to work with you specifically on your specific strengths and weaknesses. The second best paid resource is going to be live courses, because you have it's still a one size fits all kind of thing, but you have a pre-structured curriculum and a live instructor who you can ask questions to and like kind of customize a little bit. And it's going to be usually significantly less expensive than a one-on-one tutor.
Right.
Most GMAT tutors are going to be like 2,000 US and up. And then most of these live classes I'm talking about are going to be between 1 and 2,000, give or take. And those are kind of the next best option if the tutoring option just isn't a fit for you personally, or you want to be in a classroom with
Right.
other humans, which I've found for certain types of learning styles is quite helpful. The best live classes are at Test Crackers. It's testcrackers.org.
Okay.
They're a smaller brand. And the most popular live classes are the larger brands. And the problem with that is those larger brands are bigger businesses, which you would think would make their resources higher quality, but those live classes are the highest margin product in their offerings,
Right.
because you pay the instructor usually not that much. You might be surprised how little GMAT class instructors make sometimes. Some companies are a lot better about that, obviously. But after the first 1 or 2 students enrolled, it's all profit for the company. And for most of those larger companies, not to throw anybody under the bus by name, they're not reinvesting that margin into the product quality
Right.
and iterating. They're investing it into marketing, which is why those products are so popular, because those live courses drive a lot of the upsells for the larger companies. So like you're much more likely to buy tutoring from a company that you took a class with.
Right.
So we're all business people. I'm not saying there's anything good or bad about that, but from the student perspective, that's something to consider with the larger brands.
Right.
Whereas the smaller brands, their whole entire business is built on word of mouth. So they have to make sure that their product quality and delivery is really good. So that's why I like the smaller brands for the live classes. But
Yeah.
if you're that big brand shopper, go for it. Like you'll still get a good program with the live classes. Next best paid resources are going to be the self-paced digital courses. In that range, I think if you need help with quant, Target Test Prep is really good. If you need help with verbal, probably GMAT's going to be a little bit better fit for you personally. And that's especially if you're like an English language learner, their program's a little bit more set up for that type of person. And then if you are really budgetarily constrained and you just need something that's like under 500, then I think Magoosh is probably the best bang for the buck. But if you can afford to go for the target test prep or the GMAT options, depending on which section you need help with, I would choose those over Magoosh just because they're a little bit more robust solutions.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that was super helpful. For myself, I've used target test prep. I've spent some time on Magoosh. You can tell the difference. I think target test prep kind of similar to GMAT Club. So at times it feels overwhelming, just the amount of problems and all of that. But if you can leverage that, it can definitely be played to your advantage. So yeah, I think and even for myself, I've struggled with this, but sometimes I'm curious, like, how much money do I want to spend on this? But realistically, it's going to be an investment to go to business school, and so the extra couple $1,000s that you spend on this, if that can get you to the better business school, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the cost that you're going to be paying at another point. So I think that's just an important reminder of why you're doing it all. But kind of a question that's a little bit more open-ended for you. You've worked with a lot of students. I'm curious kind of what have been some of the traditional or some classic issues that people face, that not that it was a quick or easy fix, but where are some ways that people have just gone wrong, where for you at this point, after helping so many people, it might be blaringly obvious, but where are some of those classic pain points that people have had and that you've been able to fix?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. The first one we already touched on, which is delaying the first practice test too long. It's a super, super common thing. And it seems very logical in the moment. And also a lot of us have the emotional resistance to it of it's just scary.
Yeah.
So I think getting over that is really, really important. Because you can't really find the most optimized path from point A to point B if you don't even know where point A is. Like,
Yeah.
it sounds so obvious when you think about it that way, but in the moment, as students and a lot of times perfectionists, like that's not the way we're thinking about that first test.
Right.
So that would be point number one. Point number two that I think is the biggest place where people shoot themselves in the foot a little bit with GMAT prep, which is also one of the most fixable things from the beginning, is just expecting that doing a bunch of practice questions is going to move the score.
Yeah.
That's a very, very logical assumption to make because most other tests work that way. But particularly on the verbal side, I've found that to not be true. It's very unusual that someone can just do 300 or 1,000 practice problems and see like a linear progression in the score.
Yeah.
And that's also very, very emotionally defeating when you feel like you've invested all this time and energy and it's just not showing up in the end result. And a lot of people give up at that point. So the thing that you want to do at the very minimum is you want to make sure that you can write down for verbal questions why the right answer is right and why the wrong answers are wrong for every practice question that you do. There's a lot more you can do on the like robust and technical review side of things, but that's like a simple actionable thing that's quite memorable that if you implement would probably save you like 2 to 3 months on average, I would say for most people. And then on the quant side, what you want to do is you want to keep a list of questions that you didn't know how to do the first time you saw them, or that took you a long time to do the first time that you saw them. And what you want to do is you want to make sure the first 10 to 30 minutes of every study session are resolving those problems on a regular basis. What a lot of people do, and this is popular on the internet, is they'll make an error log, but they're just putting questions into it and not really revisiting them on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And that's better than not logging the questions. But what happens when you do that is you're just burning through tons and tons and tons of new problems,
Right.
which number one, like we talked about, isn't guaranteed to move the score. But number two, there's actually a limited number of really high quality practice questions out there. And so if you burn through all the official questions on your first pass, it then gets a lot more difficult to make gains down the line.
Yeah.
So I think if you can get that first practice test done, and you can write out why the rights are right and wrongs are wrong in your verbal questions when you're doing practice problems, and you can keep a log of the quant questions that are tough for you and resolve them on a regular basis,
Yeah.
I think you're going to be a super, super happy camper in a few months.
Yeah, no, that's great advice, and I can relate to what you mentioned with just feeling defeated about putting in the work, or at least feeling like you are with just excess practice problems and not really seeing the score go up. So I think it is just always important to reflect on what are you actually doing, because this is going to be a little bit of a different approach than when you were maybe studying for an exam in college or in high school. A similar question, you kind of alluded to it, but if you're a non-English speaker and you're just trying to maybe get up to par so that you can handle kind of all the other aspects that come along with the question, of understanding why it's right, why it's wrong. What are some ways, maybe outside of kind of a traditional GMAT prep, that someone could work on their verbal skills and their reading comprehension and all of those things? It could also apply to just English speakers, natural speakers too. But what are some things that people can do that will help their GMAT score, but may not feel like technical studying day by day?
Yeah, really important. I think the main thing to accept if English is not your strength yet is that that part of the exam is going to be a challenge, and you do want to meet it head on from the beginning. The very first step with that is getting a book from Manhattan Prep called Foundations of GMAT Verbal. It's free on Amazon. You can go get a digital copy, and you can either download the Kindle Reader app to your computer, or you can just read it on their web app. And I would just work through that whole book cover to cover, except skip the part on sentence correction, because sentence correction isn't on the new GMAT Focus edition. And this book is only going to be older editions for a little bit until Manhattan gets it updated. But that's a book that's specifically built for people whose first language or mother tongue is not English. And so there's a lot of really good actionable advice there that'll set a good foundation for you. So that'd be step number one. Step number two, perhaps unsurprisingly, is just read as much as you possibly can in English. There's a few different ways you can do that. The challenge with this is you have to do it without interrupting your study time and your work time too much. Obviously, if you're studying full time, you have a big advantage. You can read a lot more than someone who has a job, but most people studying for the exam are going to have jobs. So what you're going to be doing is getting stuff on your phone and reading like 15 minutes while you're in an Uber, or for 10 minutes while you're waiting for your buddies at the restaurant, or breaking the action at the party and you're using the restroom. You're going to squeeze in, 5 minutes of reading, and you're going to feel like a crazy person probably when you're doing that stuff. But honestly, like that's what it takes to overcome what we can unfortunately call a significant disadvantage, because every word on the exam is written in English, and you have word problems in the math section, and you got English written out on the data interpretation questions. And it's a lot. It's a significant challenge, but it's totally overcomable. In terms of sources that you want to pull from for your reading, anything that holds your attention is good. So if you have to read Harry Potter 6 times between now and when you take the GMAT, don't be afraid to do that.
Yeah.
But actually on your channel, there's some really, really good advice where you go through all the, I think, email lists that you're subscribed to, like ExecSum and Morning Brew. Am I remembering that properly?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So those kinds of sources are awesome, because that's going to be information that you're going to want to start engaging with as you get into your MBA program anyway. Like virtually anyone in finance is going to tell you like, hey, you need to be reading the Wall Street Journal every single day, at least a few articles, like know what's happening with interest rates, know what's happening in capital markets. Like this is obviously more important for some professions than for others, but it's just a good idea as someone who's going to be a business person for the rest of your career to just have a finger on the pulse of what's happening with M&A, what's happening with VC, what's happening with AI.
Yeah.
Things are just moving so fast now, and it's going to continue to do that. So it's a good habit that you should engage with anyway.
Yeah.
But it also has a side benefit of making you a better reader, because it's on the computer screen, which is how you're going to take the exam. And it's also fairly technical writing most of the time, which is what you're going to see on the actual exam itself. Side note, if you really struggle with the science passages, which I found is common for a lot of business school folks, there's a good website called phys.org. It's PHYS, PHYS.org. And it's just thousands of technical science articles that are about the same length as what you'd see on the exam. So not critical, but it's a good thing. And the great thing about those resources is you can have them on your phone. So again, if I'm in the ride share, the Lyft or the Uber, if I'm waiting for my buddies, if I'm walking down the street to get a coffee, or I'm waiting for the barista to make my espresso, I can kind of just go through an article or two real quick.
Yeah.
And that helps out a lot. The last thing for English language learners is just make sure you're using the official guide questions, whether it's paid for the new version, which I definitely recommend, or if it's free for an older version if you can't afford the new version. Then just make sure that that's the primary source of practice questions that you're using, because it's very, very difficult for third-party providers to replicate those verbal questions.
Yeah. No, I think for me, I mean, I was fortunate, first of all, to be a natural English speaker, but also that I think I'm just more inclined to the reading aspect. So my scores have always been stronger, but I too struggled with, and I'm sure this is something you face a lot, but rereading a sentence, a line. And I think that's kind of like a classic meme at this point now. But just rereading something until you really know it. And so I think for me, with the newsletters and even just reading nonfiction books and things like that, it's kind of getting comfortable with understanding that, okay, you're not going to remember every single word. You're not going to fully retain absolutely everything. So you have to be comfortable with that. And so that was a big thing for me, is just understanding that. And then also just because of the time constraint, you only have the 2 minutes or so per question. So you really can't be giving up that time. So I think for a lot of people, yes, getting in the habit of reading. So it can be a fiction book, something that holds your attention, like you said. But the GMAT's not going to read like a fiction book. So it is important, once you have that down, to really make sure that you're able to handle something a little bit more technical, and something that you don't understand, something that you have to learn. Because as you said, a lot of the science articles, they're facts. They're something that you're learning. So that was just always something super helpful for me. And then, of course, there's so many advantages to being up to date, current on everything, just for the rest of your life and your career. But yeah, I think regardless of if you're a non-native speaker or if you are, learning and just reading as many things as you can will help you. So yeah, I think that was a really great answer. And you clearly did your research with my channel. I'm a big fan of the newsletters, so kudos to you. Another kind of similar question.
It's good. Great advice, man. It's great advice.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things too. I mean, for me, it just makes the world make more sense. And even it's still amazing also, as someone who just enjoys learning, some of the GMAT articles, I honestly do, I haven't ever looked this up, but I hope they're all right. Like, I hope they're all accurate, because there's definitely been conversations that I've had with people where it's like a random fact that I've learned in the GMAT. And so I really hope it's not like just all AI generated and, nonsense. But, if you approach it with the right mindset of thinking, oh, I'm going to learn something from this article, and try to enjoy it, it makes the process a little bit better too.
Agree 1,000%.
So on a similar note too, everyone has different strengths, different weaknesses. The beauty of the GMAT exam is you can kind of determine, or you can choose how to approach it. So what section you want to take first. Are you starting with quant? Are you starting with verbal? And there's a lot of different approaches online. And of course, it's different for everybody. But some people say you should start with your strength. Some people say you should start with your weakness, what you're most afraid of, so you can get it out of the way. I'm curious, from your experience helping a lot of students, what have you seen to actually work? And maybe what worked for you. What do you think is the most logical approach to how you structure the exam?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because I think a lot of people get stressed out about it, because now there's more orders in which you can take the exam than ever. And actually, when they were piloting Focus, they brought in a bunch of us from the test prep industry to like give feedback on the new format before they launched it. And that was like a pretty hot point of discussion, is like, is it good or bad that I can take the exam in any order that I want now?
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is GMAC, the people who write the exam, they actually did like a huge research study using the previous version of the exam where they piloted testing section orders, and they found out there's no statistical significance between the orders of the exam. So like, statistically speaking, there's no advantage to any order of the test. And I always like to lead with that when people ask me this question, because I think the most important thing you can do is not worry about it too much.
Yeah.
The exam is already stressful enough. There's already enough riding on it. There's already enough to think about and spend your mental energy on when it comes to solving difficult and complicated questions, managing your time, which is often scarce for people, that the last thing you want to be worrying about is like, which order should I take the sections in?
Yeah.
Having said that, I've experimented a lot with it with my clients. And the thing that I have found that works best is the thing that you like best intuitively. So there's there's actually relatively few places on this exam and in the prep process where you can just trust your intuition, but this is actually one of them where you can just go with your gut. Whatever you like best, I would do that.
Yeah.
And I would experiment with different orders when you're taking practice exams. But for that first one, don't worry about it too much. Just do quant, verbal, then take a break, and then do data insights last. If you're looking for a strong recommendation so that you don't have to think about it for the first test you take, if you have an idea or a hypothesis you want to test with your initial baseline practice exam that's different than the order that I just mentioned, by all means, go for it. But just don't let yourself get overwhelmed by the, 30 different permutations of exam orders that you can take and where you take the break after the first or second section. Definitely think about it. Definitely experiment with it. All of us I don't want to say all of us, most of us are a very self-selecting group and we're habitual optimizers. And so we're going to do some kind of little calculus behind the scenes there.
Yeah.
It's part of what makes us great business people in the first place. But just notice if you're going too far down that path and just stop thinking about it. It's probably not going to make that big of a difference.
Yeah. No, I think I wasn't aware of the fact that there was no statistical difference. So I think it's helpful to know. It takes the pressure off of it a little bit. Because yeah, for me, I started with quant because that is where I knew I struggled the most, and it is naturally what I was most anxious about. And so in my mind, I thought, okay, if I can start with this and get it over, then like the rest of the exam will be easy, quote unquote. And while the rest of the exam was still probably easier, because I was starting with quant, I think if I remember correctly, like I had a question pretty early on that was pretty challenging, and it kind of really got in my head. And so I think sometimes having just kind of an easier start to it where you can really get firing, because I also took mine at like 8:30 in the morning. So, just something to wake you up and get a little bit more in the zone, I think could be helpful, which just reflecting on my experience, I think might have been helpful for me just because, again, there were so many jitters, there was so much, writing on it. So I think it is important to test out a few different things. But another question.
Super valuable to talk to people about their experiences with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's been the helpful thing for me, honestly, just through this whole time talking to you. When I was studying for the GMAT, I really didn't have many other people in my life who were taking the exam that could understand it. And so that's obviously different than high school when everyone's realistically taking the ACT, the SAT at the same time. I probably didn't do as well as I should have in terms of collaborating and studying. So I'm trying to redeem myself now. But that is one of the challenges. Taking the GMAT at times can feel lonely if you're the only person doing it. You're working late hours just to come home and study. Like that isn't very fun. But it's nice to feel that you have a community, and that's why I try to post this content and try to be as relatable and authentic as possible, because it is a challenge. Everybody goes through the challenges. Everybody can relate to a lot. So that's what I said actually in one of my videos is, find that community, follow those people on TikTok, like be active on, the GMAT club, things like that, because it just makes you remember that it's not just you who's going through this. And there's a lot of people all over the world who are doing the exact same thing.
Super important. Great advice. I couldn't possibly agree more.
Yeah. I mean, because I guess my question to you now, I mean, this might be a little bit different, but from your experience, what has held people back the most? Is it their actual technical knowledge, or is it their mindset that holds people back? Because I think sometimes, an exam like this is so stressful. There's a lot riding on it. It's the difference of going to one school and another. So what have you seen as being kind of what holds people back, and how can they make sure it doesn't happen to us?
Yeah, awesome question. I think the main thing is that the GMAT looks like tests you've taken in the past, but it works totally different than tests you've taken in the past. And that really contributes to a lot of the mindset issues that people confront throughout the process. I would say that the technical aspect is a strength of most people who are taking the exam. Like pretty much by definition, if you're thinking about getting a graduate degree in business, you've already been through a lot of school in your life, and you know how to learn things study for tests, and like perform at least moderately well on tests. The vast majority of my clients are people who don't consider themselves great test takers, and they've never been great test takers, and like that's why they work with us.
Yeah.
Like that's a very self-selecting group. But there's also plenty of people out there who are fantastic test takers, who have been great test takers their whole lives, and then all of a sudden they get to the GMAT and the score doesn't move or it goes down, which was my experience back in the day. My first 3 practice tests were all worse than my initial practice tests, and they just kept going down, even though I was studying a ton in between those exams. So, I mean, you can imagine how that felt to me as someone who historically had been successful academically. Like, I don't think I won't say I had never struggled with a test, but like if I studied for the test, I would perform well.
Right.
Like that was me
Yeah.
all the way throughout school. I wasn't that person who showed up without studying and just, aced it. I had plenty of friends like that, but I was always that person where like if I could get the study time in, it would be fine.
Right.
But then when I got to the GMAT, I mean, it really made me question my identity and like whether I was like good enough to go to business school, if I'm being honest. And it was like a really difficult and vulnerable time. You brought up like the inherent isolation. Most people in the world don't go to top MBA programs by definition. They're very selective schools. And when you work in the kinds of institutions that, folks like yourself work in, and people who have similar career tracks to you, you're exposed more often to those people who have the higher education thing. But even then, within that group, not everybody's going to get into Harvard. Not everybody's going to get into Columbia. Not everybody's going to get into Booth. And in some ways, let's call a spade, that's what makes those schools desirable in the first place. Like a lot of Stanford's status comes from the fact that it's a really great program, but a lot of the status comes from there's only going to be a few people who get in every single year, and it's a very limited, scarce resource. So you want to accept the isolation piece of it as just part of the investment. When I'm investing, I'm always thinking about the other things I could spend that money on that would be a lot more fun right now. And an investment is not spending the money on that stuff and getting something hopefully more awesome back down the line. And I think that seeing the isolation part of the process as part of that like cost part, it might hurt a little bit, is really important so that you're not shocked if it happens. But also I end up giving people this advice all the time is like, even if you're studying a lot and you have a lot of gains to make, you should still make time for 1 to 2 social engagements per week, no matter what. And I don't recommend just sequestering yourself in the study room or the office 100% of the time, because it just usually becomes counterproductive after the first few weeks. But anyway, getting back to your question about how to avoid some of these pitfalls. The first thing you can do is understand that the scoring algorithm behind the GMAT is totally different than tests you've taken in the past. Every test you've taken up until now in this point in your academic career is based on accuracy. How often am I right? How infrequently am I wrong? If I'm right 90% of the time, I get a really good grade. If I'm wrong 50% of the time, I'm probably failing and I probably have to repeat the class. And so a lot of us come into the GMAT expecting it's going to be like that because it looks like those tests that we've taken in the past. But then you start to get really confused because you'll see some tests where you get fewer questions right, but you get a higher overall score than the past test where you got more questions right, but the score is lower. And that can really, really, really mess with people's heads. And so you want to recognize that the way the exam is scored is not based on how many questions you're getting right and wrong. It's partially based on that, because I can't just get them all wrong and get a great score, but that's not really the main thing that's driving the result. What's driving the result is the difficulty level of questions that you see as you go through the exam, and particularly the difficulty level of the last question you see. This is a major, major revelation and a huge mindset shift that almost everybody has to undergo when they're studying for the GMAT, because some people, like less than 1%, can just go in and get a ton of questions right, and it feels like a standard exam for them. And those are the people who have the like genetic gift for tests. For the vast majority of people, that whole mindset shift that I'm talking about is going to be a major, major stumbling block, because you're going to get into the test. You're going to be trying to get every single question right. You're going to overspend on the first 5 or 10 questions, and you're going to run out of time at the end, which is going to make a nosedive in the difficulty level of questions you're going to see. Because as a lot of people know, but not everybody, the GMAT's a computer adaptive test. So when I get a question right, the next question is going to be harder. If I get a question wrong, the next question is going to be easier. A lot of people understand that, but they're not really building a strategy around it. That's dangerous. That's the biggest pitfall. So you want to understand that you need to start making the transition from how many questions am I getting right to how hard are the questions I'm seeing at the end of each section.
Yeah.
If you can make that transition, then you can avoid a lot of the difficult mental battles that people come up against, because you're just cycling through a ton of questions, but you're not really improving your overall time management on each section. You're not really pacing the section properly. You're just going in trying to get a lot of questions right without any big picture strategy.
Yeah.
So that's probably the biggest point of departure that is the least talked about in the GMAT industry, because what sells programs is, hey, you get 1,000 practice problems and you get 1,000 hours of instruction. And as a student, I'm like, hey, that sounds great.
Yeah.
That's probably what I need. Like, sign me up. So I'm not saying those programs are bad. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have a sales and marketing strategy for your business. Like, obviously, we're all in business. Like, we understand the realities of those things. But as a student, what you want to do is start thinking about, okay, what are the questions I know I can get right? And let me build a bulletproof process so I never miss those.
Right.
And then how do I start to recognize when a question is going to be too time intensive, and start to make peace with the fact that I'm going to have to guess and let that question go and maybe be wrong. And this brings us full circle with the whole type A thing. It's a very difficult test for type A people to get great at, because 99% of us are going to have to let our ego go a little bit and be comfortable like burning maybe 3 or 4 questions at some point in the section that we just could do if we had 6 minutes or 10 minutes a question, but there's no way that we're going to do in 2 or 3 minutes. And that emotionally is a very difficult thing to get over.
Yeah.
But if you want a little bit more help understanding how the scoring algorithm works, we've got a free video on our website, TheGMATStrategy.com, where you can go and I'll walk you through a few more details so that you can get on the other side of that pitfall from the beginning of your prep.
Yeah. Well, fantastic advice. I mean, I've learned so much from the conversation today. So thank you, Isaac. For the audience, if they want to learn more about your services, where can they find you? Of course, you just mentioned the website, but what's the YouTube channel? What's the website? What are you able to do for people who are looking for that help?
Yeah, if you want to find our free content, there's a ton of it that we put out. It's at TheGMATStrategy on pretty much any current social channels. If you search on your preferred platform, we should pop up. And feel free to DM us if you have specific questions about your personal situation. We never pitch in the DMs. We're just here to help out. And if it's a fit and you want to work with us, then we're happy to talk about that. But if not, it's totally all good. No pressure either way.
Yeah. Well, perfect. Isaac, this has been a pleasure. I look forward to staying in touch, and I'm sure there will be some more questions in the comment section of this video. So maybe we'll have to do a part 2 in a little bit, but really appreciate you coming on, and just thank you so much.
Anytime, man. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks for being such a great creator and such a positive voice in the space. I know you're helping tons and tons of people out just by sharing your journey. So thanks for the opportunity to come on and hang out, man. I really enjoyed it as well.
Yeah. Awesome.